views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Coming up on Perspectives, my next guest is pretty passionate about the issue of voting rights, the Supreme Court, as well as the Constitution. She also makes it a priority to pay attention and report on key decisions coming out of the Supreme Court. She looks at the cases and I should say gives an impact on the law, how it actually affects people. And guess what? You're going to watch Perspectives. And on this edition of Perspectives, we go front and center talking about the Constitution, race in America, and where we go from here. That starts right now.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let them know.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime, and of course, we thank you for watching. And as always, you can check out Perspectives every week here on BronxNet's Channel 67. If you have Verizon Files, that'll be Channel 33, or anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. We also encourage you to stay connected to us via all of our social media platforms. How do you do that? Well, you can get connected at BronxNet TV. For myself, my personal professional page on Facebook is Daren C. Jaime, and also on Instagram and Twitter, DC Jaime 23. There you can get some information as well as inspiration. Well, today on our show, we go front and center with the U.S. Constitution, America, race, and race relations. Our guest today, a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College. She is also a writer, a civil rights attorney, and also the founder of the Law and Policy Group. In 2012, she had a major distinction, but she's also now an author of many books, including The U.S. Constitution and African American Context. But most of all, she's a dear friend to this show. We welcome now Professor Gloria Browne-Marshall to the show. And Professor Marshall, good to have you. And how you doing?
Nice being here.
Hey, look, let's get right into it here as we talk about the Constitution. We see people exercising their constitutional right for free speech and protest in the wake of the death of George Floyd. So much is going on. But let's talk a little bit about Constitution and where we are. People are really exercising their constitutional rights.
They are, and I'm very proud of them. The last line of the First Amendment is that the people have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And that's what they're doing. They're petitioning by going out in the streets. They're carrying signs. They're making their voices heard. And the grievance is the killing of people of African descent with impunity by police and by white civilians that has been going on for 400 years and needs to stop, must stop, and must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And because it hasn't been, people are making it known, not in my name are you to kill people trying to protect white America from people of color.
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic. Everybody says this, and I don't know if you get the same sentiment, but do you get the sentiment that this time something is different?
This time something is different, and not everyone can put their finger on it, and I'm having a problem putting my finger on it as well. One thing that happened over Juneteenth, that's June 19th, when the order came down to the deepest part of Texas in 1865, saying that, that people of African descent were free and the war had ended and that they had absolute equality. That order stated they had absolute equality. So the fight that we're talking about, the one under law anyway, has been from 1865 until 2020. There have been so many battles along that way, many of them culminating in change, as we know, with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act. and then the riots that took place after the assassination of Martin Luther King. But at this point, it's like a convergence of all of those different things have come together with a diverse group, all stating at the same time, enough is enough. And so I've called this period the American Spring.
Yeah.
We had the Arab Spring, we had the Prague Spring, and now we have the American Spring, in which young people and others have said, as we go forward, there has to be a change. And many people have said, oh, but it's not going to last. How much change should we have? And I'll tell you this, Daren. African Americans have been fighting for their own freedom. 200,000 Black troops fought in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln said, but for those Black troops, the North would have lost that war. We have fought time and time again against heinous crimes exercised against us and no prosecution for those crimes. If people walk away today and leave us alone in our battle, I'll still be Black and I'll still be fighting. But for right now, I think with our American Spring, let's do this together, for the moral values of this country cannot persist with this type of murder and brutality still taking place in the 21st century.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of allies that have actually stepped up. And I think that this time around, I can only date back to the 60s, and looking back at the 60s and that civil rights movement, where there was a certain sector of white America, Caucasian Americans, and others that weren't of African descent or Black descent at that time, really raising their voice. But now we're seeing more than ever, Black Lives Matter marches that have great white support. And then also I'm looking around and I'm saying there are white people who are actually running protests and rallies, and they're saying Black Lives Matter. And sometimes there's not even a Black person in the crowd.
Well, think about, there are protests taking place globally. So London, Paris, and Amsterdam, places in Eastern Europe, there are protests where they're screaming Black Lives Matter. And I'm quite sure there aren't that many Black people there, as compared to the United States. There are images of George Floyd around the world. So this idea that the African American power has been, think about, we've had power all of this time. No one can convince me. I've done too much writing, too much research on the African American power. It's the power we have that gives us this threat in their minds that we're going to take over. So I'm going to tell you this. We could have white people stand up, people of Asian descent, Native Americans, whomever. But at the end of the day, it's what we want as African Americans, our destiny, our free will. We're the ones, we put the conscience in the Constitution. We put the soul in this country. This country knows it, even if it denies this knowledge. The world knows it. The African American movements have changed the world. Our 1955 Montgomery bus boycott led to the fight for independence by African nations. We were the voice in America and around the world behind defeating apartheid. The power of the African American is there, and people have joined hands with us. But as I said before, if they step away tomorrow, I'll still be Black and I'll still be fighting.
Yeah. Got about 2 minutes left in this segment here, but I want to get to this place of, and maybe I'll take it to the next. I'll put that on the next segment. I want you to keep this under your hat, talking about the Constitution and how we have to deal with some parts of the Constitution that still do not grant equality and or equity towards African Americans. That's going to come up. That's going to come up in the next segment. So I'll give a little tease to that right there. But when we look right now, we talk about the things that are going on with regards to voting and voting rights. It's a huge struggle right now. I mean, primary day is this week, and it's hard to imagine that even right now the struggle still continues.
Well, I voted, and it was a very clunky process. The procedure was unknown. There's now this whole thing with a touch screen, and it's like you're having a touch screen in a time of a pandemic. It makes no sense. There are too many steps to it. The people didn't know how to do it. I can't even imagine how this is going to work with so many people trying to vote coming up for the November election. And now that Trump has already decided that he's going to be using voter suppression tactics by paying people, putting $20 million worth of funds into the hands of people to be poll watchers. So we've already seen what these people have done when they fought back against social distancing and taking over the capitals around the country. I'm concerned about outright bloody warfare over the election coming up, or whether or not when Trump loses, he'll vacate the office. So there's a lot to talk about regarding the Supreme Court, voting rights, and even just the process of voting in all the different states, New York City included.
Yeah. Well, we'll take a quick break, come back and talk more about that. Then we're going to talk about, after the break, the Constitution. The 3/5 clause still remains in the Constitution. With all the pressure that's being mounted right now, could we see a change to the 3/5 Constitution, 3/5 law in the Constitution? Talk about that in a minute when we return here on Perspectives. Back here on Perspectives, continue our conversation with Professor Gloria Browne-Marshall, who is also a playwright and author of the book Race, Law, and American Society. And before the break, we were talking about the Constitution and how in the Constitution, African Americans are considered, blacks are considered 3/5 of an American. With all of the pressure that's being mounted on Washington and across the world, could we see possibly a change, Professor Marshall, on this issue of the 3/5 Constitution rule?
Well, the 3/5 rule was placed in the Constitution back in 1787 to determine, when you're adding up the population, at the number of representatives to the U.S. representatives of Congress. So technically it's been repealed, but the words are still in the document itself. So the 3/5 clause is in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. So 3/5 of all persons. Unfortunately, it's there to remind us of what the Congress thought of when populations like South Carolina, where more than half of the population was African American, but it's not actually in use now But I think as a historical document is evidence of what this country did to African Americans and counting them as 3/5 of a person for the sake of determining the number of representatives from that state. Because when you think about it, it's not as though any of these politicians were representing the interests of those people who were enslaved. They were just using them for political expediency. The same thing that's going on right now, just like counting the incarcerated people in these different counties as part of their population. And so those representatives and those other politicians in those towns get to have more resources from state, local, and federal governments based on the population in those prisons. But they're not going to the incarcerated saying, how can I better represent your interests? It's so much connected to the 3/5 rule that it's scary. So I think in a way, sometimes it's best to leave things in, even though they've been repealed, just as a historic reminder of how we're doing the same thing again and again, especially in our criminal justice system.
And so when we talk about the criminal justice system, obviously a lot of reform still needs to be had there. A lot of work needs to be done. And that's a part of why we see people out there protesting, and we see people protesting. Then we have on the other side the whole issue of voting rights. We are in the middle of primary elections here in the state of New York. And of course, as we get closer towards November, how do we see things playing out from your perspective?
Well, two things. One, I would be remiss if I didn't say no amount of police reform is going to be effective, truly effective, without prosecutorial reform as well. The prosecutor's office around this country has too much power. They have too much discretion. There's no oversight. They are allowing police officers like Chauvin and so many others to do what they do, terrorize the Black community, because they know, the officers know, that the prosecutors are working hand in glove with them and they're not going to prosecute those officers. Also, the criminal justice system has ruined the lives of so many people of African descent, and because they have felony convictions, has forced them out of the political process. It's called a civil death. They don't have a voice in their community because they have a felony record. And lastly, there are too many jurisdictions that are using the fines from racial profiling in order to finance their budgets every year. So the criminal justice system has played havoc in the lives of African Americans, undermined our voting rights, and being used to put over 2.2 million people in jails and prisons, too many of them African American. And that has to stop. Not just police reform, but the prosecutor's office must be reformed as well.
Yeah. And we've got a lot of work to do, especially moving towards November. A lot of conversation. But talk to us a little bit about your book, because in your book you talk a little bit about the voting rights, and give people a little bit of a perspective there.
Well, there's been a voting rights war, and that's why the title of my book is The Voting Rights War, because that war for the vote and the voice of our community has been there since 1619, when the 20 and odd Africans arrived into the Virginia colony. And last year we did this whole commemoration around 1619, the 400th commemoration, without understanding that, the removal of voting rights for those Africans in that colony, the laws that allowed for unfair criminal justice, then the killing of Africans in 1669, and there was no criminal punishment for the Europeans who killed Africans. So much of what we're dealing with right now was put in place 400 years ago. So we have been denied a true voice in our community for hundreds of years. And that this is the same this year. It's the same year 100 years ago that the women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. 150 years ago, men gained the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. And we have been fighting as people of color, as African American women, to have our full right of citizenship, to have a voice in our community ever since. And so every year we are encountering photo ID laws, voter suppression laws being taken off the polls. We have to understand that we're all in this war, and it means more than just one vote. We have to have our whole family vote, our whole community vote. And this has to be an ongoing experience in order for us to be truly represented in this country.
Yeah. Let me move the topic on. I want to talk a little about the no federal anti-lynching legislation that's going on right now. We see a lot of things happening on the state level, sometimes on the city level, but we know, of course, the federal level operates in a totally different mindset. What are we seeing there with regards to that? I mean, there's some legislation that should be coming forward.
And I want to make sure we understand history and go back to that African Ghanaian term, Sankofa. And Sankofa is based on the bird that goes forward with his head going backwards, meaning that we have to understand our past to better, understand our present and then plan for a better future. And the reason why I say this is all for the betterment of our community is because if we don't understand that the criminal injustice laws, the unfair voting tactics, all of these things have been taking place for hundreds of years. So when we had our first Black man cast a vote in 1870, when Black men gained the right to vote, the backlash was immediate. We had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We had terrorism, John Birch Society. We had the federal courts turn their backs on us, and congressional civil rights laws began in that time period of the 1860s. So the power of the Black vote, the power of Black movement has been a warfare for us to have, or the foothold we're supposed to have as citizens in this country. And so we can't ever deny our past, that this is a fight, and it will continue to be a fight. It's a war for the vote, because in the vote, it's not just the presidential election. It's about all those minor elections that we think of or don't think of when it comes to our representation, and how funds are going to be spent in our community or channeled to another community if we don't say something. This is also the U.S. Census year. And so we need to make sure we fill out the U.S. Census forms. We can participate. We shouldn't feel like we have no power. We've always had power. We have power now as well.
Yeah. All right, taking a quick break. We'll be back with our final segment with Dr. Gloria Browne-Marshall when we return right after this. And we're back here, Our Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. We are continuing our conversation, talking about race, America, the Constitution, and all that is going on. Yes, and as we were talking a little bit before the break, Dr. Marshall, we talked about a lot of the things that really we need to be paying attention to. And in a time like this, while there's protests going on, civil unrest going on, a lot of action is taking place in Washington and some inaction. But what are some of the things that we should be paying attention to happening out of Washington right now?
Well, one is the federal police reform bill that has been put forward, but it doesn't contain oversight for the prosecutor's office, which makes me concerned because Kamala Harris's background is as a state, local, and prosecutor. She rose to be the highest prosecutor of the state of California as the attorney general. And so I'm kind of concerned that without the police feeling that these crimes that they have committed will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, then they still have impunity. Officer Chauvin knew that murder violated not just the constitutional rights, but murder violated the rights of George Floyd when it happened. So I don't understand why the prosecutor's office did not come forward from the very beginning, except for the fact that they work hand in glove together. I also am concerned about anti-lynching federal legislation that's not in place. since the time period when Black men gained the right to vote and there was freedom in 1865, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime, there has been waves of lynchings, the heinous murders that send a message to the community to stay in your place, stay subservient to white power. Unfortunately, this federal government refused to pass anti-federal lynching legislation, no matter how many times it was put before it. So finally in the House, they would pass a bill, the Senate would filibuster and stall the bill. And now we finally have anti-lynching federal legislation again. And Rand Paul in the Senate has blocked the ability of a vote on that bill. So after all this happened, and the fact that this whole country, who, as far as the protesters are concerned, witnessed a lynching in the murder of George Floyd, we still have state by state anti-lynching legislation, and yet no federal anti-lynching legislation. And the hate crime legislation is not enough, because a hate crime means that a person actually commits an assault and then shows by intent that it was meant to be a race-based assault, or assault against a person based on their sexual orientation or based on their religion. So if they didn't say, I'm killing you because you're Black, then there's no way to show the intent or the mindset of the person committing this crime, making it a hate crime under legislation. But a lynching, the person doesn't have to say, I'm doing this because you are Black. You can then assume the intent based on the type of crime and the method and the measures taken to kill the person.
Yeah. And when we talk about America for a minute, obviously America and slavery, we're the last on the food chain, if you will. Share with us a little bit about how America was kind of like the last on the food chain when it comes to the issue of slavery.
Well, it's interesting. I traveled to Angola last year because part of the 1619 400th commemoration, I wanted to walk in the footsteps of Queen Nzinga. And Queen Nzinga fought the Portuguese in the 1600s to try to stop the slave trade in Angola, because the Portuguese began the European slave trade. And then we had the Spanish and the French, and even the Dutch were involved in the slave trade. The English were pretty late to the slave trade, but when they jumped in with gusto. And so there were no slave laws in the colony when those 20 and odd Africans arrived in August of 1619. But in that same year, in July of 1619, the first legislative body controlled by landowners was created. So those landowners wanted free labor. They came up with laws that would then make Black people or Africans perpetual labor class. And that's how you end up with slavery, chattel slavery, or movable property. So it's always been about greed and the nexus between greed and lawmakers. And that's what we're looking at right now. How do you get rid of Black competition? You keep killing Black competition. You undermine the education of Black competition. You threaten Black competition. You put them in poor housing and give them poor food. And then you make their lives unstable and miserable. And that's what the people have been doing, white supremacists and others who have bought into white supremacy in this country. It's been a long road, but now this is a time where we must make a change.
Yeah. Well, we're going to leave it there, Dr. Marshall, and we want to thank you so much for sharing with us here on Perspectives. Of course, as we get closer to November, you got to come back. You got to share with us a little bit more so that we can be able to gear up.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you. And we want to thank Dr. Marshall for being with us. And we also want to thank you, the viewer, for watching. And listen, that about wraps up with this edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime saying thank you. Take care. God bless. But most of all, share your perspective with somebody else. You never know. It just might make a difference in somebody else's life. Take care.